All right, I know that many of you are joining us today, so I'm going to give just 2 more seconds for the room to fill up, as it were. All right, 11:31 by my clock. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this panel on the 2020 elections. I'm Didi Kuo. I'm the Associate Director for Research at Stanford's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. This seminar meets every Thursday, but instead of our usual speaker, we have organized a panel today of election experts to discuss what happened on Tuesday, what's been happening for the past few weeks. And our event today is co-sponsored by the Stanford Center for American Democracy. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists before we turn to each of them for about 10 minutes of discussion. Then we'll open it to Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. First, we have Nate Persily, the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, with appointments in political science, communications, and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where he runs the Cyber Policy Center. He was the Senior Research Director for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration and has been leading the Healthy Elections Project with MIT since the pandemic began. Also, Professor Hakeem Jefferson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, whose research interests are at the intersection of American politics and social psychology. And finally, Bruce Cain, Professor of Political Science at Stanford University and Director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. So before turning it over, just a brief lay of the land. We are still awaiting results from key states, including Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, which I think has only been called by Fox News. So neither candidate has received the 270 electoral votes needed to win. This election season has itself been very different than usual because it's taking place under a pandemic, which affects how voters vote, how they're mobilized, and has also become an election issue in its own right, with cases surging in many parts of the country and over 230,000 Americans dead. We also know that President Trump has spent weeks employing rhetoric that sows distrust in the electoral process. He has already claimed victory in any number of states that are still counting ballots, whereas Joe Biden has been urging patience. And finally, this election has really highlighted just how different election administration is state by state. They are not necessarily new problems, but are vulnerabilities that have been exacerbated by pandemic conditions. There has been a lot of discussion of ballot access questions, voter suppression, et cetera. So these are some of the topics that we hope to take up here and some of the ways that this election has been somewhat unprecedented. So Nate, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you so much. Needless to say, this is a busy time to be an election law expert. I'm going to talk about the administration of the election and then where we are right now. I'll try to sort of split it in 2 halves there. But thank you, Didi, and the other panelists for joining me here, and the 1.2 or 1,200 people who are joining and listening. Let me start with this bottom line on the administration of the election. It is unbelievable how successful and professional this election was run up until November 3rd and afterwards. But the fact that we were able to put out an election or administer an election in a pandemic, making unprecedented shifts in the election infrastructure in an incredibly short period of time is remarkable. There were problems on election day, there were problems in the mail balloting, and we are going to see in these contesting proceedings in the next few days, a lot of arguments about how this or that process didn't work, right? But if you look at where we were 6 months ago with the primaries, where you had 97% of the polling places in Milwaukee closed down, or you look at 20% of the absentee ballots in New York being tossed, New York City being tossed, what we were able to pull off as a country, and the election administrators who are the first responders for democracy are to be given credit for this, what we were able to pull off is truly remarkable. And you can see that in the voter turnout statistics, where we had over 100 million votes that were cast before Election Day, another 50 or so that were either received after Election Day or were cast on Election Day in polling places. And when we started this Healthy Elections project, Charles Stewart and I, were specifically focused on 2 large categories of issues. One was moving people to vote by mail who had not voted by mail before. And the second is to retrofit our polling places to make sure that people could vote safely. On the move to vote by mail, while there are hiccups and problems, most notably the concerns about the Postal Service, the process of mail balloting went unbelievably smoothly. Very few ballots, it seems, at least as a share of the total number of ballots, have been disqualified for one reason or another. No doubt there will be hundreds of thousands that will be received late and will not be counted, but that was true in 2016 as well. And it looks like a much smaller share of mail ballots will be discounted this time or not counted this time as compared to 4 years ago. And at the time then when we sort of began this process of transformation of the infrastructure, you might have thought that these states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, that had historically had incredibly low rates of absentee balloting would not really be able to meet the challenge. And they moved from, say, 5% absentee ballot rates to roughly 50%, and they did it with remarkable success. Now, this is not going to be the story that's going to be told if we get into a recount situation, because you pick apart each one of the aspects of the mail balloting process. But it depends in some ways what your baseline was. And for them to make that kind of transition was extraordinary. And I should say the way that the challenges they had to overcome had to do with everything from getting the supply chain up and running, right, to deal with things like paper, envelopes, getting the mail ballot sorters, extractors, and the like. There was a lot of infrastructure that needed to be put together, as well as training to deal with mail balloting. And this was all, of course, done in the COVID environment, right, where you know it's extremely difficult. You can't even have office meetings to try to train people and get everything done. We are seeing that play out, by the way, in the vote counting process, which ordinarily you might have teams of people looking over each other's shoulders, but social distance is going to prevent some of the normal way that we do vote counting. So that's on the mail balloting side. What about on the polling place side? It became quite clear early on that a lot of voters were not going to vote by mail, and both Democrats and Republicans had concerns about the mail. The Democrats, because there was increasing concern about the Postal Service, as well as what we're seeing now, which is that there was concern that the late arriving ballots would be different than the same day ballots. And then Republicans were taking a page out of, well, or taking a tweet out of Donald Trump's feed, which is to say that they, you know, were anti-mail balloting because of fraud, lack of reliability, and the like. We haven't seen any real claims of fraud. We've seen probably claims of fraud. We haven't seen any evidence of fraud. In fact, it's not even clear what the claim of fraud is. It's not, you can't sort of just wave your hands, especially if you're a lawyer, and say, well, yes, there was fraud here. You need to figure out, well, what illegal votes were cast? What's the cause for concern here? In fact, just today in Nevada, the Trump campaign is making arguments about illegal votes being cast by ineligible citizens. That's the most concrete accusation, but it's not, it's just hypothetical. There's no actual evidence of those sort of mysterious votes being cast. And so what happened with polling places is that you saw polling places, well, we had long lines in the primaries and we had long lines in the early voting in places like Georgia. You did not see systematically the sort of long lines either in the late early voting process or even on election day. These were remarkably well-run facilities. Sure, there are isolated instances here and there, but part of the point is that so many people had been moved to the mail balloting process that you didn't have the glut of voters on election day. But you may remember, and I told you about Milwaukee, that there was, there was real concern about our ability to set up polling places as well as to staff them. And so while there are many fewer polling places this year because states like California moved largely to vote by mail, same with obviously Nevada, New Jersey, Vermont, and the traditional vote by mail states, the consolidation of polling places did not seem to lead to lower voter turnout, right? And one concern that we had, that we spent so much of the summer working on, was this issue of poll worker recruitment. Maybe familiar with the group Power the Polls that really stepped up to recruit over 500,000 new poll workers. And in the last month before the election, they were trying to knock down the doors of these election offices, saying, look, take more people, take more people. We have a surplus, because people really stepped up to volunteer. But they were adequately staffed. They had lists of people who were not even, were on the reserves, and you didn't see many polling places that had to be shut down because of lack of poll workers. One would hope that that may even be a permanent sort of cadre or core of poll workers that could be activated 2 and 4 years from now, because as is well known, the average age of a poll worker historically has been over 60. They didn't show up, a lot of them this year, because of COVID concerns, and the hope is that we have a new core going forward. So the administration of the election, by almost any traditional standard, was successsul. So where are we now? And so let me talk about the lawsuits and the counting process. So there's a lot of, so some of the chants that we're seeing outside of canvassing boards and the like are stop the vote. The vote has already been cast. The question is about the count. Are these votes going to be counted, and what happens then? And so the answer is they are going to be counted, and usually you don't have lawsuits that prevent votes from being counted, legally cast votes. If you are going to contest the outcome of an election, you do that once the election, the count is done, and then you ask for a recount, as is happening, it appears, in Wisconsin, or you otherwise make allegations about fraud, disenfranchisement, and the like. And so we're seeing lots of different types of cases. I'm happy to take questions to focus on any individually, but let me just talk about the kind of categories of cases. You've got a set of cases that revolve around the process. One that the Trump campaign won today in Philadelphia, trying to make sure that there are observers who can stand very closely to people as they process the ballots. That's being appealed by the Philadelphia Election Commission to the state Supreme Court right now. But none of that really has at least immediate implications for the numbers of ballots that are counted. There may be some greater observation. I think one of the things we're realizing is that not only do you need to have social distance when it comes to polling places, you need social distance and other kind of prophylactic measures being taken in the vote counting process as well, to make sure that there is social distance. But that'll be resolved, and it's not clear what the actual concern is about what the ballot counters might be doing. It's all being, you can see the live stream of the process if you're interested. Then there are a set of cases where the issue is provisional ballots and curing of absentee ballots. So many states allow for people to cure any defect in an absentee ballot. And here the allegation is that the Pennsylvania election officials went beyond state law in allowing people to cure deficiencies in those absentee ballots. The facts are not as important as, again, the category of cases that we're talking about, because as I mentioned, the argument is that these officials, and then maybe even the state Supreme Court in earlier decisions, went beyond what the legislature had provided in law. And that is sowing the seeds for a federal constitutional claim, which has actually already been up to the Supreme Court in the pre-election period. And that concerned whether essentially either the state courts or the state administrators have usurped the power of the Pennsylvania legislature, thereby violating the US Constitution's provision that says each state shall, in a manner determined by the legislature thereof, appoint a number of electors. And so right now, those suits have been not successful. They were not successful in the pre-election period, though on the issue of extending the deadlines, in which this came up in Pennsylvania, it went to the Supreme Court and they split 4-4. They split 4-4, or at least let the decision stand at the Supreme Court twice, both before the election and then afterwards. But we don't know which way Justice Barrett might go in a case like that. But those ballots have been segregated in Pennsylvania, the late arriving ballots that were sort of vindicated in that Supreme Court action. And so if the margin of victory extends beyond that, then it is, as we say, beyond the margin of litigation. There are arguments that you can start seeing the seeds of arguments about political bias or regional bias that they say have sort of creeped into the vote counting process, or even in the vote casting process, so that certain counties are said to have allowed for the curing of ballots as opposed to others. And so that sets the stage for a very familiar kind of argument from Bush versus Gore of treating different voters differently in different jurisdictions. And then, as I said, there are some claims starting to percolate about how some of these ballots might be illegally cast, but those are the least well-formed because there's really no evidence of this. And so right now we're at the throw spaghetti at the wall stage of kind of pre-litigation, which is to try to figure out what might be the universe of arguments that could be launched at this process. But we're in a very different situation than we were in 2000 with Bush versus Gore, when this ballot machine, the Palm Beach butterfly ballot, punch card machines really determine the outcome. And that's because we're not focused just on one state. There's many different states where this litigation is going on. And there's not a consistent legal theory. You may remember the sort of hanging chads, right? The punch card ballots that were at issue in the Florida recount. Right now, there's just so many different arguments that it doesn't, and they're inconsistent arguments, so that the Trump campaign is asking to count the vote in Arizona and Nevada, but to stop the counting in places like Georgia and Pennsylvania. And so, but that is also not atypical for election litigation, that you have this throw spaghetti at the wall period. Usually you wait until after the votes are all counted, but right now, they're trying to sort of see if anything is going to stick. But ultimately, the thing that matters is the margin, because if the margin is big enough, then none of this litigation is going to matter. Margin both within a state as well as in the Electoral College. And if more than one state, it would be necessary to overturn in order to change the Electoral College map, whoever the victor is, then that is a very tough hill to climb. And I think that we may be there in the next day or so, because we're going to be getting a lot of information out of Pennsylvania and Nevada, as well as Arizona. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues. I think I may have exceeded my allotted time, and happy to take questions.
Very informative. So now we'll turn to Hakeem Jefferson.
Nate, I think you were answering all the questions we all have, so you can take as much time as you'd like. But I'm honored to be in the company of Nate and Bruce today as we discuss these historic elections. And I'm a scholar of race and politics, so I wanted to use my prepared remarks to discuss the election in that context, and happy to answer questions on that score as we move forward with the conversation. And so it's in the context of race that my remarks will come. So for the past many years, the most powerful person in the world has exploited these long-standing divides among the American public. In particular, Donald Trump has appealed to white identity, white racism, and xenophobia. He has scapegoated the most vulnerable members of society. He has emboldened white supremacists and given rise to a dangerous form of ethno-nationalism. In moments of great crisis, namely in response to protests against police brutality, he has used the power of his office to enact state violence against fellow Americans, and has made more precarious the lives of racial and ethnic minorities. And more than that, as Nate just mentioned, and as Didi mentioned as well, he has worked to undermine democratic institutions and trust in America's electoral process. And I think what should pain all of us are the great and brazen efforts taken to make it harder for Americans to vote. Disabled Americans, Americans of color, young people, and those who are most vulnerable to the effects of an ongoing global pandemic. And make no mistake, it matters when the President of the United States calls for local officials to stop the count, as he did on Twitter this morning. Again, it calls into question the credibility of what appears to be, as Nate just mentioned, an election that was carried out above board in many jurisdictions where elections take place in this country. And the president's rhetoric once again emboldens his supporters, who will use his rhetoric to justify the actions they take if the outcome is one they do not prefer. American democracy, to put it lightly, is in peril, and the outcome of this election will have immeasurable consequences for its future. Let me make a few key points before we move into an open dialogue here. Donald Trump is not an aberration in American politics. His election in 2016 was no fluke. The president's message, one steeped in the politics of grievance and resentment, clearly has an audience in this country. Such a message long has. There are those who will once again litigate precisely what led so many to support Donald Trump in this election. Some of my colleagues in the discipline will ask, well, was it racism or was it economic anxiety? This is a false choice. We cannot talk about feelings of disaffection among white Americans without thinking and talking about race and racism and the myth of white supremacy. White people who come to think of themselves as left behind are not thinking of themselves as left behind in some vacuum. Instead, as a bunch of scholars have told us, they perceive that they have been left behind as others, especially undeserving racial minorities, have made significant gains, they perceive. Gains that they believe have come at their expense. This deep investment in whiteness and the desire to maintain the power of a shrinking white majority will likely animate our politics for decades to come. But as we're seeing as the votes continue to be tallied, this coalition of support for the president is not comprised by a majority of American voters. Joe Biden will almost certainly win the popular vote, and he will do it having gained the largest number of votes in the history of presidential politics. The fact that this race is close is because of the undemocratic nature of America's political institutions, which give an outsized amount of power to a small share of American voters. Despite these challenges and the challenges that come with the undermining of the electoral process and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, minority voters across the country will likely prove crucial in delivering the presidency for Joe Biden. And the power and persistence of minority voting blocs and activists and organizers cannot be overstated or taken for granted by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But as the scholar on this panel who studies race, I'm sure that there are those among us who will ask me to make sense of what appears to be an overperformance by the president among some minority voters, especially Latino voters. First, I want to caution against making too much of exit poll data in this election. I, for one, am waiting for post-election analyses from folks like the folks at Latino Decisions, and I'm listening to colleagues who are experts on Latino politics. I would suggest all of you do the same. These scholars have often reminded us that Latinos differ in how they see themselves racially. They differ in their socialization experiences as they relate to politics and ideology. Generation and language matter. Religion, culture, and custom matter. And though there is good reason to think about notions of solidarity, as so many scholars have, these early results suggest even more reason to be skeptical of our assumptions of groupness and to take seriously the diversity and the politics of those we too often homogenize in our thinking about politics. Our tendency when it comes to minority groups, particularly groups that support one party at levels as high as African American and Latino support for the Democratic Party, our tendency is to forget the diversity and opinion that is masked by something as blunt as partisan identity or vote choice. In my own research, I think a lot about diversity in the politics of Black Americans, and I'm particularly interested in Black people's attitudes toward policies that are perceived to target or affect other group members. Punitive criminal justice policies are one example of such a policy. What I highlight in my work is that there is significant support for these policies among a subset of Black Americans, and that this support is most strongly associated with Black Americans' feelings about how other members of the group should behave or comport themselves. What I find in this work is that this worldview focused on behavior and comportment structures and guides the way that Black Americans come to engage this set of policies. I mention this work here because I think we are surprised by minority support for a candidate like Donald Trump when we assume wrongly that these groups are monolithic and that individuals' political behaviors are always informed by the question of what is good for the group, a group that some individuals may sometimes have only a loose connection to in the first place. As I've been thinking about and puzzling over Latino support for Donald Trump in places like Texas, I've been thinking a lot about the work of David Cortez, a professor at Notre Dame, whose brilliant scholarship draws our attention to Latinos working as part of immigration and customs enforcement. Here's a line from an interview Cortez did with one Latino Border Patrol agent who described co-ethnic migrants as not his people. They asked, the Border Patrol agent said, "How can you do that to your people?" And I'm like, they were born in Mexico. I wasn't. If they were my people, I wouldn't even be touching them because that would mean they were born here. To understand the complexities of Latino politics and the politics of other minority groups, we should attend to scholarship like David's and listen more to those on the ground whose experiences paint a much richer portrait of group politics than the ones often on offer by pundits and political elites. But despite these complexities and the frustrations of this election, when all is said and done, one truth will remain, and the bottom line of my comments is this: race matters a great deal in American politics, and it will for a very long time to come. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Hakeem. All right, so next, Bruce.
I'm going to just make 5 points. I'm going to focus a little bit more on what the meaning of the election is as it's emerging so far, understanding that there's still a very important question that has to be decided about who the president is. I still think there are some lessons that we can pull out of this, even at this early point. So one, which I think follows on what Hakeem was talking about, which is the role of demography and diversification of the electorate. And I want to make a very simple point, which is very similar to Hakeem's, and that is demography was definitely something the Democrats were counting on, and we can see its effect when we look at the outcomes. If you look at what's happening in the West and the Southwest, and you see that states like Nevada and Arizona, New Mexico have gone, and Colorado have gone blue. That wasn't true 10 or 15 years ago. It wasn't clear that that was going to happen. And now you have Texas that's very close to going blue because of changes there. And it brings to mind that one of the most powerful demographic forces, quite apart from immigration or about changes in the birth rates between white and non-white, one of the most powerful forces is the movement of white-collar workers. And if you think of what happened to Virginia, or you think of what happened in New Hampshire, in the southern part of New Hampshire, the northern part of Virginia, what turned those states from being essentially red states into blue states was the migration of white-collar workers into those states. And the same thing is happening in the American West. The American West, you see in places like Austin and Santa Fe and Salt Lake City, you see that there have been a tremendous boom in high tech, in white-collar workers. There may be even more of it as a result of COVID, where people are seeking to get out of the urban areas. And that sort of declumping of these blue masses that have been in the urban areas on the Pacific Coast states seems to be changing and transforming parts of the American West. On the other hand, I'm with Hakeem that you've got to be very careful when you see these changes to look much more carefully. And his point about the Latinos is a very good one. In reality, it's something we've known for quite a while. Back in the scholarship in the 80s and 90s, the Latino political surveys that were done by Rudy Lagarza and others showed very clearly that there were huge differences between the Cubans and Central Americans and Mexican Americans. So it's very important that you don't write off these groups, that you look much more carefully at what's going on and what their dynamics are. The second observation that I have about the election is there was a blue shift in many states, but no blue wave. The blue shift was something that a lot of us in political science and in law were talking about over the last couple of years as we anticipated this election, and anticipated that what we had seen as a pattern with Democratic voters walking in their ballots for various reasons, and so that the ballots then had to be counted after Election Day, accounted for what happened in California when 5 or 6 seats flipped in California as a result of ballots being counted that were dropped off by voters on Election Day. This phenomena was called by Ned Foley the blue shift, and actually, this election, we've seen some red shifting, particularly in Ohio, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a blue shift. It's not a demographic fact. It had to do with the nature of the get out the vote strategies and tactics. In this particular case, in this election, the blue shift is largely, I believe, caused by the fact that some people lost faith in the post office for obvious reasons, because the post office had shut down its service, whether for political reasons or economic reasons, we'll leave aside. And so my guess is that there were a fair number of Democrats that wanted to make sure that they dropped their ballots off. And that's why those ballots have to be counted. It was just a matter that because the president and his appointee had made the post office less efficient, there was no reason to believe that your votes would get delivered. And indeed, of course, we still are looking for like 300,000 absentee ballots that are allegedly missing around the country. I think we got some idea that it's randomly across the country, but we'll see. Third point I'll make is that, and nobody has mentioned it yet because it's not something social scientists want to talk about, we have more polls, but apparently we have no better certainty about the outcome as a result of all this polling activity. The number of polls have proliferated. We've tried to make them more predictive by taking the average of these polls, but all these polls have different methodologies and they're very strategic about when they get released. But the bottom line is that once again, like in 2016, the polls were off, and they were off in a way, as the president rightly complained about, that overestimated Democratic support. I have been checking with people who do this kind of polling, and I would not say that we have a really good idea about why. There are lots of theories about why, ranging from Trump supporters who don't trust the media and don't trust pollsters and therefore are ducking it, to various kinds of algorithms that were, shall we say, not calculated correctly, to God knows what. Maybe it's just as basic as this. Polls and surveys are very valuable in trying to understand the basic patterns that are out there. And so if you're asking about, do we understand how white voters are thinking or black voters are thinking or people in states that have fracking are thinking, you can get basic trends out of polls. But I think we've put too much of an emphasis on polls as a predictive tool. And I think honestly, going from what people think and their preferences to whether they're actually act has a lot of other variables in there. And I think the emphasis, we have to de-emphasize the notion that these are predictive in any way. We need to tell people that polls are noisy data. We need to be upfront about the fact that pollsters have a hard time predicting turnout, that it's basically witchcraft when it comes to the methods that they use. And that we should do more of what some of these sites like the Economist site and 538 have done, which is say, well, what if the polls are off by 3% this way or 3% that way? And people have to understand that when they see the range of possible outcomes, that tells you that you really don't know with great certainty what the outcome is going to be unless it's way outside that range of possible error. Fourthly, if Trump prevails by lawsuit, and I don't think he will, but if he were, there is something that I think is bothering a lot of political scientists, which is the current state that we have right now. You not only have the Electoral College, which basically sets the, if you like, the goal line for the Democrats further away than it is for the Republicans. The estimates were, that for the Democrats to be safely out of any kind of problem with the Electoral College, they had to win by 5 to 7 points. And instead, of course, we're at the 2 to 3 point difference in the popular vote. And as a result, we're looking at very, very tight races determining the Electoral College. So there's that first concern. Then there's the second concern that you've got the Senate, which is, again, by the same rules and the same logic, also has a minoritarian bias, the small state bias. You combine that with the fact that the Senate controls the Supreme Court appointments. And so a lot of, it's quite likely that if you didn't have a Republican-controlled Senate, that Amy Coney Barrett or many of the other Trump appointees wouldn't have made it through. You would have had something that possibly was more centrist in their appointment. It's hard to, depends upon whether, of course, the Democrats completely controlled it. But if you had divided government and you had supermajority rules, it could have been a much more centrist appointment. And then you have the voter suppression efforts that are going on in various states. So you accumulate that all, and we start to look like South Africa or Rhodesia, where white voters are trying to hold on desperately to their power using various tricks and various biases that are in the political system. And the problem is that I think our expectations of democratic control being the control of the biggest group, at least a plurality, if not a majority, those are the expectations that we have at the state level, at the local government level. The only place we don't have it is at the federal level. We have it for historical reasons, but you combine all these things, and if you're losing on all these different dimensions, and if the majority is getting suppressed, you get something very close to what the founding fathers called minority tyranny. And I'm worried about that. And then lastly, I'll say, whatever the outcome of this election, Democrats have to pay attention to the lack of success that the Democratic Party achieved below the level of the presidency. Right now, it looks like very few state legislative houses will flip. It looks as though the House, right now, the Democrats are going to lose at least 5 seats. And it looks like, unless the Democrats really luck out, the Republicans are going to retain the Senate. Now, some of this is because of what I was talking about before in terms of the minoritarianism that we have in the country, but some of it actually is a signal about how divided we are and how whoever takes over the presidency is going to have a very messy situation, that all of these divisions that Nate and Hakeem were talking about, they're not going to go away. There's still going to be people that don't want to wear their masks. There's still going to be divisions between Democrats and Republicans about whether or not we should be giving a bailout money to states. There's still going to be divisions over whether Obamacare should be chucked or whether it should be maintained. We still have pressing problems of climate change that we cannot get on the same page between Democrats and Republicans. So whoever, even if we end up firing the boss has left us a very messy situation. And we really have to start thinking about how we navigate across these divides to try to develop some common ground on these issues, no matter who the president is. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much to all of our panelists for these trenchant analyses so far. So we have, unsurprisingly, a lot of questions. The first one, Nate, are you available? Okay, so most of the questions so far asking about things you probably don't know, but what's happening in Philadelphia and Maricopa County? What is the timeline for some of these counts to come in? What are the margins going to be that lead to a recount? And how patient do we need to be? How much longer is this going to take?
We need to be patient. I can't tell you how patient and for how long, but I think there's going to be a lot of news in the next 24 hours. So I would think by the end of Friday that we would have a very good sense of who has won this election. Now, that doesn't mean we will know, and that doesn't mean the process is over. To some extent, the critical question is, and I know this is not really the legal question, at what point do the decision desks of the major networks and the AP feel comfortable saying that one or the other candidate has won the election? And, it is a perverse fact of our election administration system that we essentially outsource those declarations to media organizations. But it is a function, we don't have a national election authority, and so we do delegate that to those folks. So for example, the fact that Fox News called and the AP called Arizona, maybe prematurely, is nevertheless quite significant because of the perception that it has created about where that state is. And keeping eyes on these decision desks in 24 hours is quite important. Now, on the particular issues in Maricopa County or in Philadelphia and the like. So I think that we should have we're not going to have all the votes counted this week. And in fact, just so we're clear, right, this is never the case. You always have millions of ballots that need to be counted weeks after an election. We are in California are mainly responsible for that because we have such long periods where we can accept these ballots. But you're going to see the vote totals nationally go up by 5 million or more from election day, just because of the pace of mail voting. So there's, technically, and I saw this question in the chat, there's the certification happens somewhere around 2 to 4 weeks after the election. It depends on the state. And the certification is really what's critical in terms of determining who won the state. But, a lot of this could be subject to litigation and the like. And so I do think tomorrow night we're going to have a very good idea, but that's based on just what I'm seeing, in the pace of vote counting. Clark County, for example, in Nevada is taking its sweet time, which continues to mystify me a little bit. They have fewer ballots remaining than some of these other states, but for various reasons, they don't feel that they should or can do it as quickly as possible.
Also, anytime I pose a question, all three of you are welcome to jump in. The next question has to do with polls, why is it that the polls have been so wrong? Bruce, you started to talk about this a little bit, but there are, you're right, a lot of different types of polls that employ many different algorithms, but do you think it's possible for other sources of information to be used alongside polls, or are polls just here to stay and we're just going to need them to be improved somehow?
Well, I don't know that we have an alternative to polls. Some people say, hey, well, you can just monitor social media. Yeah, that's not going to work. Okay. So, look, most of the time the polls are right. If we took all the thousands of races in a given cycle, the polling usually is, the outcome is sufficiently great that the polls can be off a couple percentage points and they're going to get it right. Part of the problem with polling right now is that, particularly at the national level, the level of contestation is so great that you're trying to make predictions when the error term of these polls is typically around 3%, plus or minus 3%. So, what's a little odd, and I think properly people are going to go after pollsters after this, is we had a lot of them that were predicting national totals of, difference of 10 or 12 points. And that seems to me outside the range of what you would expect for normal error. And that's where it gets into, okay, one culprit possibly is that, people are so inundated with polls, some fractions of the electorate are not answering their polls. Another possibility is that as we've moved increasingly into trying to remedy the fact that people don't answer their polls, or that we're using something called opt-in polling, i.e., rather than taking a random sample, we take big, large group of people, and then we try to go statistically and manipulate it to look like what we expect the electorate to look like at the end. That puts a lot more pressure on the turnout aspect, which we're very bad at predicting. So part of it is, people are more reluctant not to answer the polls. People have moved to cell phones. Polling has gotten harder is one answer, okay? Secondly, polling has become more dependent on modeling. And those of us who watched the modeling with COVID know that modeling has its problems in terms of the assumptions it makes. Garbage in and you'll get garbage out. So if you've got bad data, then the polls are not going to predict very well. So here's my advice. Treat the polls as noisy data, not as tablets from heaven.
Okay, another question now about faithless electors. People are worried that the way the Electoral College works, with the electors casting the final votes for the president, could cast them differently than was decided in their state. And this gets at a bigger question about Electoral College reform. There are obvious reform proposals on the table, like the national popular vote, which would require an interstate compact. So what is the likelihood that we reform the Electoral College anytime soon? And what is the likelihood of faithless electors?
Should I take that? Or, okay, so the first thing is that it's going to be extremely difficult in the short term to do major electoral college reform. Yes, it's possible that this national popular vote compact could get off the ground, but I think it's unlikely. I actually thought that that might be on the table if the Democrats had won the Senate as part of a large set of democracy reforms. In fact, I thought that might be maybe the first piece of legislation that Congress would consider. But I think that, you know, if the Senate does remain Republican and the government remains divided, that it's unlikely you'll see much here. And, you know, the Electoral College changes are one of the stickiest parts in the Constitution, right? I mean, for a document that's extremely sticky already, right? Which is that this bias that's sort of structurally embedded in our system, as is the Senate, of course, is almost impossible to dislodge unless you get a national consensus, right, that is going to reform it. You know, there's, like I said, the National Popular Vote Compact is one way to try to get around it. You know, we'd have to see if many states, other states would adopt it, but I think that that remains a long shot.
Yeah, let me just add, you know, normally the faithless election problem is taken care of by the way in which these people are selected. Okay. So typically the candidates end up selecting party officials, relatives of party officials, allies, etc. So you don't, with a few, it's usually only a handful of people that threaten to be faithless electors. The problem, I suppose, would be magnified this time, and I'll throw it back to Nate, if we actually have a victory that's at 270, which is entirely possible if Biden wins the Arizona and Nevada, you get to 270, and he doesn't win Georgia, North Carolina, or Pennsylvania. So then you're right on the number. And then you might sweat that there's a secret agent that snuck in somehow. And I'll let Nate talk about whether there's any recourse on the part of the parties, but I think the answer is no, but I leave it to Nate to say.
I was asked
Hakeem
that.
also, I think, wanted to jump in. Oh, go ahead, Nate.
Hakeem, no, please, Hakeem.
So Nate, why don't you answer this faithless elector question?
Okay, well, I'll say that I was asked this on NBC Nightly News last night, and I said, let's jump off that bridge when we get there. You know, you know, we've always wondered what might happen under that circumstance. And frankly, in 2016, we had a record number of so-called faithless electors that led to a Supreme Court case just this year, Chiafalo, in which the court upheld the power of states to punish electors who would be faithless. But not every state has a faithless elector law, which would essentially tie their hands. And so then we, you know, get into the question of what happens if an elector feels, you know, that they're able to cast a vote for other than the candidate that they are pledged to. It is a possibility, right? It is a low likelihood possibility. And I agree with you that if we're on the 270 line, that makes it more dangerous or more likely that that could happen. But, you know, it's, there are so many things that have to happen before we get into that world that I sort of want to focus on the conflicts that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in quickly because I think a lot of us have these questions about how to expand democracy, how to make American democracy look more like the thing it ought to look like. And I just wanted to note very quickly that we can't sort of disconnect these beliefs about the expansionary nature of democracy from Americans' attitudes about race, right? And we know from some recent work by Larry Boitell, a political scientist, that white Republicans' attitudes or Republicans' attitudes about democracy are bound up with their attitudes toward outgroups. And so as we sort of push for these reforms of the Electoral College and these other sort of expansionary reforms, we're going to run into these same sorts of obstacles that we've highlighted already in the conversation. And so just wanted to note that as another roadblock to the expansion of democracy that I think many of us who are small d Democrats would call for.
So there are a lot of questions that actually follow directly on that about Trumpism as a political force. So Trumpism is, like Hakeem said, sort of the enmeshment of white supremacy in our national politics, which has always been there, but it's sort of much more vocal now. So when we look at this election as a repudiation or a sort of implicit tolerance of Trumpism, it's not as much of a repudiation as many people had predicted or hoped. What do you think of moving into the future, the prospects for a Biden administration? Let's say Joe Biden wins and the Democrats win the House, but the Republicans retain the Senate. What are the prospects for governance in that situation? And which wing of the Republican Party is going to dominate after this? You know, is it going to be a Trumpist wing or is it going to be something different?
Well, I'll start, and then I'm sure both of them will have comments too, so I'll keep it short. I mean, this is the million-dollar question for a lot of mainstream Republicans. This wing, this Trumpist wing, has origins in Pat Buchanan and some earlier Republican candidates, but it was the tail on the dog. Now it's the dog. And the tail, we just don't know how big the tail is, which is mainstream Republicans. We know that a few mainstream Republicans, the Mitt Romneys, the Jeff Flakes, several of the people that have left the administration, there are people, never Trumpers, who are very worried about the abandonment of democratic principles, the abandonment of conservative ideology, et cetera. And so there's no doubt going to be a fight in the Republican Party, one way or the other, whether Trump prevails or not, over where that party is going. So it's, you know, it's impossible to predict at the moment, other than to say, I do not believe for a second that this is going to go away. If you look at what has happened to the Republican Party over the last 40 years, it has maintained itself as a white party. It has stayed over 85% white through the whole period. What it did was it substituted out Northeastern moderate Republican white voters for conservative Democratic white voters. And the irony of that substitution was that it made the Republican Party much more homogeneously conservative socially, economically, and politically. So even though the demographic change looks like they stayed white, they traded different types of white voters. So, and if you look at the profile of the Republican Party, I have a paper on this. It's very boring if you want to see it. But at any rate, if you look at the profile, they've also become more working class. Okay, so the party that I grew up with, and I'm an old guy, which used to be the party of the wealthy, you know, the wealthier income groups, is now a party that has taken in a substantial number of not, you know, it's not a complete working class party by any means, but it has a larger working class component, and that shows up in the demography too. How do they reconcile that? I mean, it seemed to us 4 years ago impossible to reconcile that a person who grew up in a wealthy house, who made his money with his father's money, who basically lived this glamorous lifestyle, that he would be the spokesperson for the people that are downwardly mobile because of the ending of manufacturing and the threat of diversity. How did that guy end up being the spokesperson? Well, you know, a variety of things that we saw with Schwarzenegger, and before that, Governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura. There's something about celebrity. There's something about the so-called authenticity of the way he postures that made him that spokesperson. So I think it's going to be very hard for the Republicans to undo that formula.
Hakeem?
Yeah, I think I think Bruce is right. This is here to stay. I think that's really unfortunate, quite frankly. But I mean, you know, folks talked about Barack Obama ushering in some post-racial America. Of course, that was wrong. And folks might look at the possible and likely defeat of Donald Trump as some defeat of racism, and that would also be wrong. I doubt that the Republican Party will update as it should have or it thought it would have after 2012, I believe it was, when they had an autopsy and they were supposed to go out and play nice with minority communities. And perhaps some folks will say, well, maybe 8 years later, we've seen some success of that. I think the verdict is still out on that. I think instead, what they did was empowered a guy who I think, pretty frankly, is in many ways a white supremacist, a person who gives really empowers white nationalists and others. And I think that that's here to stay. I think that you see people like Tom Cotton and other members of the Republican Party who espouse quite racist rhetoric and talking about minority communities. And I think if this election is close, I doubt that the Republican Party will find much reason to abandon such a strategy of a strongman party that stokes resentment and grievance, that talks about the left behind white person in this country. I doubt very, very much that the Republican Party will abandon Trumpism. And I think that's a scary, scary feature of contemporary American politics.
Nate, anything on the governance aspect, divided government?
No, let's go to the next. I think that my colleagues covered it.
Okay, so there are a lot of worst case scenarios in the Q&A about what happens if if Biden wins the Electoral College and the popular vote and Trump refuses to leave office. This doesn't necessarily seem likely. There are hints that President Trump has already declared himself the victor and that he may not be easily convinced to leave. But what are the prospects for, things like election violence or a questionable transfer of power heading into the lame duck period?
So we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that if Biden does win the votes that are counted, that we will not see a concession from Donald Trump certainly soon or maybe ever. And so what does it mean when there is a non-concession? And by the way, that would be true the reverse as well. If for some reason Donald Trump is able to turn around the trajectory here, I don't think you'd see Joe Biden following the path of Al Gore right after Bush versus Gore. There's just simply too much that they see is at stake. So what does that mean? So a concession is not itself like legally significant. It's more in terms of cementing perceptions about who has won. Just like I said, the media decisions, right, are not themselves legally significant, but they are so important in shaping people's views of who won and who lost. So the certification of the ballots is what we need to wait for, and then the slates of electors that emerge from each state. And there are several important milestones. There's the finishing of the count. There's any recounts that would be conducted afterwards. There's the certification of the winner, right, in each state, done by the governor or the chief election officer. That, assuming that is done by December 8th, which is the deadline in federal statute, then you have that slate of electors will then meet for the Electoral College on December 14th. Assuming that each state has one slate of electors, those certificates are delivered to the House of Representatives. And on January 6th, there's a proceeding presided over by Vice President Pence, where the certificates are opened. And if there are two slates of electors that are coming from any given state, then Congress, both the House and the Senate, need to resolve the discrepancies over those electors, right? And assuming, but it's both houses have to do this. And then if, if you're playing out the worst case scenarios, if no presidential if there's no winner of the presidential election at any of these stages, then January 20th, the term of President Trump expires and Nancy Pelosi then would become the temporary president until there was a new president. So that's sort of the process as it unfolds. Then on the question, well, what if he doesn't, hand over power? Well, on January 20th, if there is a new president, then the power is by virtue of law transferred to the person who won. And then we get into a kind of comparative politics type question about, well, what does that mean? And who does the military follow him? Do the courts follow him? Right. But there would be court statements well along the way that we would have to pay attention to that would sort of shift public perceptions and for that matter, the perceptions of other politicians to behave in a certain way as to who the legitimate president is.
Yeah, and let me just follow up that in that scenario, he's going to have a lot of help from the Republican Party. It's not like the president can decide this on his own. He would need the state legislatures, the Republican-controlled state legislatures in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin to take action and to propose a different slate. Now, there are some people that think that these lawsuits are simply a way of running out the clock and that he's hoping that we will miss the deadline in December 8th, which is the safe harbor deadline when the certificates of delegates or these delegate slates have to be ready in order to avoid any kind of controversy. So, but to make that happen, it has to be conspiracy of the Republican Party. And if that's where we are, then we are in very serious trouble in this country. And I guess out of hope, I just believe that that's not where we are, but I don't know that anymore. I used to believe that it could never happen, but yes, it could. So I think the thing to watch is not what Trump says. Trump is going to say very predictable things. I think the thing is to see how many Republican officials are going to buy this line that there's something corrupt about the counting process and that therefore they are justified to try to throw a slate up to the Congress and then power this through in some way, which, as Nate points out, is not as easy as it looks. I'm still hoping that this is the America that I grew up with and that people won't do that.
Yeah, maybe just very quickly on this. I think for me, the concern is not so much that the president won't formally be removed from power if he loses this election, because I am somewhat hopeful that we have institutions and powers in place to remove him from office, if that's the case. But what does concern me quite a bit is the way that the language that the president uses stokes the kind of violence that we have already seen in recent months, and that we are seeing. I have my TV on silent over there, and earlier today, we saw these people outside of these counting places, and they are using the rhetoric that the president has used in his tweets. And I think whether we have the formal institutions in place or not to sort of push against the president's possible refusal to leave office or to concede, I think it should worry us quite a bit and there's a high likelihood of violence that is being stoked by this president. And more recent work done by colleagues Nate Calmo and Liliana Mason suggests that elite rhetoric matters in these contexts. And the fact that the president continues to incite this kind of violence, I think should make us all quite anxious.
So that's a good segue to a lot of questions we're getting about social media and disinformation, which of course was critical in 2016 to President Trump's victory and has been debated ever since. What was the role of social media? How did the platform's policies differ this time regarding this election? And we have two conspiracy theorists in the House who were just elected, QAnon, maybe not believers, but people who are sort of QAnon curious. What can we make of the trends on the far right on the platforms and how they have entered our national politics, and what can be done?
I'll start on this. Look, I actually think the social media story is a minor story this election. There's certainly a lot we can say about the policies. I mean, in some ways, it's a big story if you look at the confrontation between, say, Twitter and Donald Trump, which even in the last 24 hours, they blocked something like 4 or 5 of his tweets. So that's a really important story, which is how the social media companies have done something very different and taken on a country's leader, right? I mean, because this is going to set precedent for around the world, right? How they're going to deal, whether it's in India or in less democratic countries. If they set the precedent that they are going to take positions against world leaders, right? That's something they're going to take seriously. But now that's the rule. There are so many changes that happen. There's greater transparency with advertising. There were bans on advertising on Twitter. There was a moratorium on new ads during the last week in Facebook ads. There were a greater suppression of voting-related disinformation, and now that extends to the vote counting process, as well as you saw, Twitter did some filtering of calls for violence that were, some of it was election related, some of it was non-election related. To be sure, there's plenty of conspiracy theories that are gaining traction. We have an entire project here in the Cyber Policy Center at the Internet Observatory called the Election Integrity Partnership. If you go to eipartnership.net, you can see that they were tracking all the disinformation related to the voting process. And, I'm sure there's some foreign activity, but most of the story is that, our disinformation is homegrown. We don't need to import it. We don't have to have a lot of foreign actors to give us a nice repository of false claims propagated by influencers. And most of what the Internet Observatory has found is that, these influencers are sort of proudly doing it. There's not a whole lot of surreptitious work that's going on here. And so it's a very different type of dynamic. And it's not clear to me that what's happening on social media is much different than what's happening on certain cable television, right? And that's what Yochai Benkler in his book was finding and renewed paper. So I think the jury is still out, and I'm willing to believe that social media was a main driver of something in this election, but I don't see the evidence for it yet. Because I think there are just these larger themes that are that we've talked about up till now, and larger influences through all means of communication.
All right, so another question is about turnout levels in this election, which were remarkably high, and potential new voters or voters who switched parties and switched their votes. To what extent do you think these represent trends in mobilization that the parties will be able to continue to capitalize on, i.e., can Democrats hold on to the states in which we've seen a blue shift, or will the Republicans have successfully expanded their base among new voters or disaffected voters? How likely do you think these are to be pretty sticky as patterns?
Well, I'll take the first stab. I'm sure Hakeem will have something to say. I think it's kind of interesting that there are two things going on here. One is the fact that people believe this election has a lot at stake because of Donald Trump and his policies. And so what we know, by the way, is that things that turn out one side tend to turn out the other side. So in retrospect, it's not surprising that large numbers of Republicans were motivated as well. But there's another side of this, which nobody's really talking about. And unfortunately, we spoiled the experiment, so we're never going to know the answer, or at least definitively. And that is, many of us have said that we should have election day holidays. Many of us have said we should be expanding early voting for years. And that if we did that, it would pump up the registration totals. We've also, many of us said that if you release, and we've known this for years, that if you make it easier to register the closer to election and even have election day registration, that matters as well. So we've seen an expansion of early voting and absentee voting. I'm not as much of a fan of all mail voting because I really do believe that that should only be used in emergency situations. I am in favor, though, of early voting, because I think having people vote when it's convenient and having it available on the weekends and making it possible for people both to register and vote at the same time will allow us to get those turnout numbers up more, more permanently. There will always be fluctuations because people get excited about some elections and less excited about others. But we should be making it convenient for people to vote. We should not be trying to suppress the vote. We should be trying to encourage the vote. We should be trying to encourage participation. It doesn't do us any good as a society to try to keep people out of the electorate who are eligible to be there. That's just not good for a democracy.
Yeah, I would just note very quickly that I mostly agree with Bruce, though. Of course, I would say that we should have every mode of voting available to all people in every election, including all mail voting. I, for example, filled out my very long California ballot. It took a very long time to do it. I had my 2 screens going, and then I dropped it off in the postal service box on my early morning walk. That's how easy it was for me to vote. That's how easy it should be for everybody to vote. And when we make it easier for people to vote, more people vote. Lower income people vote. Racial and ethnic minorities who are burdened by the cost of voting are more likely to vote. And so that's a good thing for those of us who care about democracy and the expansion of democracy. But the reason that we don't have these policies is because not everybody is incentivized, I think, to have a more inclusive democracy. And so that's the first note that I make. About these different coalitions that have turned out, I'm always very cautious to make much of anything after an election, particularly an election that's still ongoing. And so I don't know about these defectors as they were. And I'd be interested to read and learn more about who these people are in this election. I mean, we are in perilous times. This president, of course, has overseen a crisis where he is perceived to be quite incompetent in his response. And so I think these are a unique set of circumstances. Joe Biden is a unique kind of Democrat for this moment. As someone noted this morning online, he's perhaps the kind of candidate, and this is what a lot of voters, even some African-American voters seem to believe about him, that he was the kind of candidate who could broaden the base of support. He was thought of as a safer candidate. And so I think it remains to be seen whether the Democratic Party, as more diverse candidates get to the top of the ticket, as I think I and many others might think. What do we see about this coalition that appears to have turned out for Joe Biden? But I'm not crazy enough to make those kinds of predictions on a live call in an ongoing election.
All right, so with our final 3 minutes, I'm going to ask a question about the future. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. There are hundreds, literally, that we were not able to get to. The ones that everyone in the audience can see are the ones that we think were answered. So thank you for joining us and for submitting your questions. But there are a lot of questions about unity moving forward and reconciliation. What needs to be done in the next administration, probably a Biden administration, to try to heal a fractured country and to unite all Americans? Is that going to take the form of political reform to try to increase the number of political parties? Is it going to try to address the vulnerabilities in our election administration? And even if it's just about rhetoric or about reaching across the aisle, what is it, and trying to solve this problem of white supremacy and create a more racially inclusive democracy, what can be done?
Well, I would say, I'll start again. I think step one is to look at some of the problems in our electoral system and political system. So on the political reform side, figure out if there's any common ground to clear up some of these ambiguities and problems. I mean, it would be nice to get rid of the Electoral College, but I'm with both Hakeem and Nate that that's not likely to happen. But I think we can certainly clear up some ambiguities around the Electoral Count Act. I think we can, we always learn things going through the recount process. I'm sure we'll learn some new things. So I think we try to take some steps to reaffirm the belief that voting should be inclusive, that we shouldn't be suppressing, that we should be looking to set the rules in advance and not change them at the last minute if we can. Obviously, pandemic changed that somewhat, but we need to sort of rethink the rules and figure out where our common ground is. And then with respect to policy, I think that we have to step down from the purism that both parties have developed, and we have to take small steps to recreate trust on both sides. And so hopefully that would start with the stimulus package that is being put forward by the one side or the other. I don't know whether we'll get the Democratic or Republican version, but you know what? There shouldn't be. There has to be a bipartisan version. We need that package. We cannot let people lose their homes. We can't let people, we can't have government services falling apart. We're not going to have a vaccine for a while. We need to take care of people's lives. And we have to put politics aside. The Democrats are going to have to make some concessions to business, probably, and the Republicans are going to have to make some concession to supporting governments. But that's where it starts. It starts that's where we have to start in terms of bringing back the country in terms of bipartisanship.
Hakeem?
So I agree, I think, with most of what my colleague Bruce just said. I'll just note that I am really skeptical, and I hate to not be the optimist here, but I'm really skeptical that, at least in the short term, that we're going to see this sort of coming together that I think would be in the best interest of the country. These are, as I noted in an interview with Stanford media, these are real divides. These are real differences, and they're not just differences over small aspects of public policy. People in this country disagree about questions of who belongs in this country, questions of who should be included in an American democracy. These are fundamental questions that deal and bear on people's humanities. And so I say that to say that I'm skeptical that in short order, we're going to see the kind of kumbaya moment that I think many of us would like to see. But to Bruce's point, we know from public opinion surveys that broad swaths of the American public support various redistributive programs. Mm-hmm. Americans support healthcare policies that are more expansive than not. They support stimulus packages that help them recover from a crisis. They support a good, competent response to COVID. And these are places where I think Democrats and Republicans can find common ground. But I don't know if I agree fully with my friends, even at Stanford, who focus a lot on affective polarization and the like. I think is normatively bad when people disagree, but I think it's good that people are agitating against white supremacy, police violence, and the like. And these are real divides that we ought not mask over in service of good feelings. And so I'll leave you with that note. But I'm hopeful, but in the most immediate term, not overly optimistic.
All right.
I agree with that, and I think that then there's a second set of reforms that we can start thinking about, or emphases, right, which is about how you manage fundamental conflict like this and how you use the available constitutional structure to do so. Some of this is perverse and could have really bad effects, particularly on racial minorities. But federalism is a persistent feature of our constitutional system, and so there are states that do have greater consensus than others, and are able to achieve certain sort of widely popular policy goals. And so, the devolution of authority down to states could have that effect. Now, of course, the farther you devolve it down, the more particular minorities in particular jurisdictions then are subject to that kind of consensus when it goes in the opposite direction, right? And so you have to have an all-front strategy here, which is to try to amplify the voices and the power of those who are trying to stitch things together at the national level, while at the same time recognizing that sometimes devolution of authority down to the local level can achieve some of those small wins that will, affect the real lives of people.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone in the audience, and thank you to our panelists for your really wonderful insights. We hope that wherever you are all safe and healthy, and we look forward to seeing you in the future for one of these talks. Thank you so much. Be well.